Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. We have a lot of developments to cover, so let's get to work. Commentators warn that southern China is once again facing an imminent power shortage crisis, similar to what it has experienced in recent years. Indeed, long-term viewers may feel like we have heard this story before. As southern China moves into summer, the region is seeing increasingly acute heat waves. This increases demand for electricity while also reducing water levels at critical hydroelectric power plant areas. Electricity consumption in China's southern provinces have been hitting new highs since the beginning of this year. State media reports this week that the power load of the China Southern Power Grid, which covers the 5 southern provinces of Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan, Guizhou and Hainan Island, on Monday reached a historic high of 200 gigawatts, 1 month earlier than last year. Hydropower represented about 15% of China's electricity supply last year, but this is concentrated in the south of the country. The concern now is that China may be facing the same painful power shortage and drought risks that it saw in 2022. Speaking to local state media, Gao Hui, chief forecaster at the National Climate Center, expressed this week, quote, "The duration and impacted area of this year's heat wave are still more than what we would see in a normal year," end quote. We will continue to watch the space closely. Okay, next up, and also not particularly good news, after a few weeks of speculation, top PRC officials have finally confirmed that the country is indeed seeing a second wave since the end of zero COVID and the initial first massive wave late last year. Viewers that are currently in China will likely not be surprised to hear this. Anecdotally, it seems like every man and his dog has been catching it lately. This week, respected respiratory disease specialist and senior government expert Zhong Nanshan estimated that by the end of next week there may be 40 million infections per week, quote, before peaking at 65 million per week within a month, end quote. So far the cases appear to be quite mild, though of course as this is politically sensitive, we do not have reliable data and thus cannot make a conclusive judgment on this point. Nationally, leadership have not aggressively pushed a policy of vaccine boosters, suggesting a preference for natural immunity. Next up, the Central Auditing Commission held its first meeting under the 20th Party Congress. The Commission is a senior supervisory and disciplinary organ for the party. At the meeting, Xi Jinping, who was head of the Commission, urged efforts to strengthen strategic planning and top-level design in the field of auditing and serve the party and the country with effective audit supervision services. According to the readout, priorities for 2023 are the, quote, development of the real economy, increase audit efforts on the implementation of financial support for the real economy and policies to alleviate corporate difficulties, coordinating development and security, as well as key areas such as local government debt, finance, real estate, food, energy, etc., and firmly guard against systemic risks, end quote. The meeting also noted that the auditing results should be used as a, quote, vital reference for officials' assessment, appointment, removal, reward, and punishment, end quote. Next up, fresh semiconductor restrictions have Beijing angry and concerned. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Yesterday we discussed fresh Chinese restrictions on US firm Micron. Now today we can discuss Japan, which has issued details of its proposed restrictions on sales of certain semiconductor-related technology parts and items, part of the wider US-led efforts, which also include the Netherlands, to retard PRC high-end semiconductor production efforts and ambitions. UK-based Japanese-owned Financial Times, in a story today, reports that, quote, Chinese industry executives who have examined the fine print of the intended rules say they could potentially go further than the US in restricting China's ability to make semiconductors. End quote. An unnamed PRC government source also told the outlet, quote, we are concerned about whether the US and Netherlands governments will issue export controls as strict as Japan's. End quote. China is still highly reliant on imported chipmaking tools. Indeed, one commentator called the Japanese move crippling for China's chipmaking industry, though this remains to be seen. Japanese financial media outlet Nikkei Asia reports that under the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act, Japan regulates the export of weapons and other goods that can be converted to military applications. Such exports require prior approval from the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. The 23 items to be added, the outlet writes, will require individual permissions unless they are destined for 42 countries and regions designated as friendly. This makes exports to China and certain other countries much more selective. The newly added items include manufacturing equipment for extreme ultraviolet lithography and etching equipment for stacking memory devices in 3 dimensions. Last October, Washington put limits on the export of equipment capable of producing advanced chips, in some cases 16 nanometers or smaller. For context, the most advanced chips for smartphones are 3 nanometer ones. However, the Financial Times writes, Japan's specifications encompass chips up to 28 nanometers, and in some cases even as basic as 45 nanometers. Last month, China's Semiconductor Industry Association, representing hundreds of Chinese firms, called on the Chinese government to, quote, take decisive countermeasures if the Japanese government insists on destroying the friendly, cooperative relationship between the Chinese and Japanese semiconductor industries. End quote. Of course, Beijing is not happy about any of this either. Yesterday, Tuesday, a spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce said that Beijing firmly opposes Japan's decision to impose these restrictions, adding that the restrictions will, quote, severely undermine the interests and rights of Chinese and Japanese companies and China-Japan trade and economic cooperation, damage the landscape of the global semiconductor industry, and impact industrial and supply chain security and stability. China will reserve the right to take measures to firmly defend its lawful rights and interests. End quote. Eyes are now very much on the Netherlands and what exactly their chip item restrictions will look like. As it happens, the Dutch Deputy Prime Minister, who was also the Foreign Minister, is visiting the PRC. In a joint press conference in Beijing yesterday, Tuesday, the Dutch leader expressed on the issue of chip machine restrictions, quote, like China, we have a responsibility to protect our national security. And just as China protects its core interests, so we protect ours. End quote. Meanwhile, China's chip item stockpiling continues, and with creeping US and allied restrictions, Singapore appears to be benefiting. According to the latest Chinese customs data, China imported $407 million of chip-making machinery from Singapore in April, an almost 10% increase month-on-month, and the highest total in 8 months. China's overall chip-making gear imports were still down almost 30% year-on-year, however. Though in 2022 much of the country was in lockdown, so this sort of year-on-year comparison is of limited use. Singapore is filling the gap for China somewhat, but experts point out that this is only for the middle level of the technology. The most advanced is still in the hands of Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United States. And finally for today's video, David Johnson, the independent special counsel appointed to look into alleged PRC interference in Canadian elections, issued his 55-page report yesterday, Tuesday, in a controversial move which will likely exacerbate domestic political disquietude. The report concluded that there can be no public inquiry because doing so would disclose highly classified intelligence. The report also found that, quote, PRC interference is an increasing threat to our democratic system, end quote, but added, quote, I have not found examples of ministers, the Prime Minister, or other officers knowingly ignoring intelligence, advice, or recommendations on foreign interference, or being driven by partisan considerations in dealing with these issues. End quote. Opposition parties will likely oppose the report and argue that Mr. Johnson is too close to the Prime Minister. Indeed, last week the Conservative leader already told reporters that he thinks that Johnson, quote, cannot be impartial on this matter, end quote, adding, quote, he is Justin Trudeau's ski buddy, his cottage neighbour, his family friend, and a member of the Trudeau Foundation, which got $140,000 from Beijing, end quote. In a piece published yesterday, Erin O'Toole, leader of the Conservative Party in the 2021 election, while frankly admitting, quote, political interference from the Chinese Communist Party was not the reason the Conservatives lost the election. I take responsibility for the loss, end quote, nevertheless expressed, quote, the 2021 election did see considerable foreign interference, end quote, and, quote, Canada needs to get serious when it comes to the issue of foreign interference. Canada needs an independent public inquiry on this interference in Canadian politics, end quote. And of course, we remember last week Beijing's ambassador to Canada warned against a public inquiry, which would be seen by China as provocative, to use the ambassador's words, and expressed that Canada's concerns over the integrity of their democratic system was simply a manifestation of, quote, following the US in its anti-China policy, end quote. Thus, this domestic political scandal and its effects on Canadian-Chinese relations and attitudes is likely far from over. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Wednesday wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.